My son told the courtroom he wanted to live with his father because I was never really there. My lawyer told me to accept it gracefully. I did exactly that. What the judge didn't know was that I had documented every missed visitation for 6 years. The moment my 12-year-old son looked at the judge and said I was never really there for him, I felt something inside me turn to stone. We were in courtroom 4B of the Fairfax County Family Court. The walls painted that particular shade of institutional beige that makes everything feel hopeless. And my son, my Ethan, the boy I had carried for 9 months and raised through colic and nightmares and first days of school, was telling a room full of strangers that he wanted to live with his father. His father, Grant Hollister, sat at the opposite table in a suit that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, his face arranged in an expression of humble concern, like he was just as surprised as everyone else by this devastating testimony. My lawyer, Beverly Thornton, reached over and squeezed my wrist under the table. Her grip said what her mouth couldn't: don't react, don't cry, don't show them anything they can use against you. So I sat perfectly still while my child described a version of our life together that I didn't recognize, a fiction so complete and so carefully constructed that I almost wondered if I had somehow lived a different reality than the one I remembered. But I hadn't, and I had proof. I'd been a mother for 12 years, 4 months, and 16 days when that custody hearing happened. I'd also been divorced for 6 of those years, co-parenting with a man who had perfected the art of being present on paper and absent in practice. Grant and I met in graduate school at Georgetown, 2 ambitious 20-somethings who thought we were building something permanent. He was getting his MBA while I finished my master's in public health. He was charming, driven, the kind of man who made you feel like the center of the universe when he focused on you. We got married 6 months after graduation, bought a townhouse in Arlington, and had Ethan 2 years later. The first cracks appeared almost immediately after Ethan was born. Grant traveled constantly for work, missing Ethan's first steps, his first words, his first birthday. I told myself it was temporary, that he was building a career to support our family, that things would settle down once he made partner. They didn't. By the time Ethan was 4, Grant was working 80-hour weeks and spending whatever remained on golf trips with clients. I was effectively a single parent who happened to be married. The divorce was Grant's idea, delivered over dinner at a restaurant nice enough that he knew I wouldn't make a scene. He'd met someone else, he explained, a junior associate at his firm named Kelsey, who understood his lifestyle. He wanted to be fair about the split. He didn't want to fight over custody because, honestly, he wasn't sure he was cut out for full-time parenting. His words, not mine. I remember sitting across from him, watching his mouth move, thinking about how this man had once promised to love me forever and was now calculating the tax implications of our divorce while the breadbasket sat untouched between us. We agreed to joint legal custody with me as the primary residential parent. Grant would have Ethan every other weekend and 1 evening per week. Child support was generous because Grant made $340,000 a year as a management consultant, and he wanted the divorce finalized quickly so he could move on with Kelsey. I signed the papers 3 months later. I thought the hard part was over. The first missed visitation happened 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Grant was supposed to pick up Ethan at 6 p.m. on Friday for their weekend together. At 5:45, he texted to say something had come up at work and he'd need to reschedule. Ethan had been sitting by the front door with his backpack packed since 4:30, practically vibrating with excitement about seeing his dad. I watched his face crumple when I told him the news. He didn't cry, not exactly, just went very quiet and asked if he could watch TV in his room. I made him mac and cheese for dinner and let him stay up late watching cartoons because I didn't know what else to do. That weekend, Grant took Kelsey to Napa Valley. I know because the photos showed up on her Instagram. I told myself it was a one-time thing. Work emergencies happen. He'd do better next time. I was wrong. Over the next 6 years, Grant missed 847 scheduled visitation hours. I know the exact number because I documented every single one. It started as a way to keep track, to notice patterns, to have something concrete to point to when Grant accused me of being difficult or uncooperative. But it became something more than that. It became my insurance policy, my proof, my silent witness to the systematic abandonment that was happening in plain sight. I created a spreadsheet with columns for date, scheduled time, actual arrival time, departure time, and notes. Every text message canceling or rescheduling, I screenshotted and saved to a dedicated folder. Every email promising he'd make it up to Ethan, archived. Every excuse, documented. By the time that custody hearing rolled around, I had 312 pages of evidence showing that Grant Hollister, devoted father and concerned co-parent, had actually been present for less than 40% of his court-ordered visitation time. The pattern became predictable. Grant would confirm plans with Ethan directly, building up excitement and anticipation, then cancel at the last minute with an excuse that was always just plausible enough to avoid outright confrontation. Work crisis, flight delay, client emergency, stomach bug, car trouble. The excuses rotated through a familiar cycle, each one delivered with apologetic sincerity and promises to make it up next time. Next time rarely came. Meanwhile, Ethan would sit by the window, waiting for a father who wasn't coming, and I would watch helplessly as his disappointment slowly calcified into something harder and more complicated. By age 9, he'd stopped asking if his dad was definitely coming. By 10, he'd stopped packing his bag until Grant actually showed up at the door. By 11, something shifted. He started defending his father to me. The parental alienation happened so gradually that I almost didn't recognize it for what it was. Grant's strategy was subtle, the kind of manipulation that's nearly impossible to prove in court. During the rare visits that actually occurred, he would take Ethan on extravagant outings, Disney World trips, professional basketball games, expensive dinners at restaurants where I could never afford to eat. He bought Ethan the newest iPhone, the latest gaming console, designer sneakers that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. He became the fun parent, the exciting parent, the parent who represented freedom and adventure and unlimited spending money. I became the parent who enforced bedtimes and homework and vegetable consumption. Grant never explicitly criticized me to Ethan. He was too smart for that. Instead, he asked leading questions. Is your mom still making you do all those chores? She never lets you have any fun, does it? I bet she doesn't understand how hard school is for you. The questions planted seeds of resentment that grew into a garden of grievances I couldn't see until it was too late. The first time Ethan told me he wished he could live with his dad, he was 10 years old and furious that I wouldn't let him skip soccer practice to attend a concert with Grant. Dad would let me go, he said, his face red with anger. Dad doesn't have a million stupid rules. Dad actually cares about what I want. I tried to explain that consistency mattered, that rules weren't punishment, that I was trying to teach him responsibility. But how do you compete with a parent who only shows up for the fun parts? How do you explain to a child that the person who cancels 80% of their visits loves them less than the person who shows up every single day to do the hard, unglamorous work of parenting? You can't. You just document everything and hope that someday the truth will matter. The custody modification petition arrived on a Thursday afternoon in March, delivered by certified mail to my front door. Grant was requesting primary residential custody of Ethan, citing concerns about my emotional availability and rigid parenting style. The petition included a declaration from Grant describing himself as an engaged, devoted father who had been systematically excluded from his son's life by an uncooperative ex-wife. It included a statement from Ethan, clearly coached, expressing his desire to live with his dad because his mom was always stressed and never had time for him. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely read the words. I called Beverly Thornton, my divorce attorney, within the hour. She told me to come to her office immediately. When I arrived, she looked at the petition and then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. This is going to be a fight, she said. You need to understand that going in. Grant has resources. He has a narrative. And he has a 12-year-old boy who apparently wants to live with him. Beverly Thornton had been practicing family law for 23 years, the last 15 specializing in high-conflict custody cases. She was sharp, pragmatic, and completely uninterested in sugarcoating reality. She explained that in Virginia, once a child reaches 12, their preference carries significant weight with the court. Not determinative, but significant. If Ethan testified that he wanted to live with his father, the judge would take that seriously. My job was to demonstrate that Grant's petition was based on a false narrative and that Ethan's preference had been manipulated through a pattern of parental alienation. Do you have documentation? Beverly asked. I pulled out my laptop and opened the spreadsheet. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through 6 years of meticulously recorded missed visitations. Every cancellation? She asked. Text messages, emails, calendar entries, I confirmed. Time-stamped and organized by date. She looked at me with something approaching respect. This might actually be enough. The court appointed a guardian ad litem to represent Ethan's interests in the custody proceedings. Her name was Dr. Amara Okonkwo, a child psychologist with 18 years of experience in family court cases. She would interview both parents, interview Ethan, review documentation from both sides, and submit a recommendation to the judge. I met with her for 2 hours in her office, a comfortable space decorated with children's artwork and fidget toys. She asked about my relationship with Ethan, about the divorce, about Grant's involvement in day-to-day parenting. She asked why I thought Ethan wanted to live with his father. I told her about the pattern of missed visitations, the extravagant gifts, the subtle questions that undermined my authority. I showed her my documentation. She made notes and asked follow-up questions and promised to review everything carefully. When I left her office, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: hope. Grant's interview with Dr. Okonkwo went very differently. I know because she referenced it in her preliminary report, which was shared with both parties 3 weeks before the hearing. Grant had presented himself as a reformed father who regretted his earlier absence and was now committed to being present for his son. He acknowledged missing some visitations due to work demands but claimed those days were behind him. He described me as controlling, inflexible, and unwilling to facilitate his relationship with Ethan. He suggested that I had poisoned Ethan against him for years, and that Ethan's current desire to live with him represented the boy's authentic feelings finally breaking through maternal manipulation. Dr. Okonkwo's preliminary recommendation was inconclusive. She noted concerns about both parents and recommended further evaluation. I read that report sitting at my kitchen table at 11 p.m., fighting the urge to throw my laptop across the room. The weeks leading up to the hearing were the longest of my life. I gathered additional documentation, affidavits from Ethan's teachers confirming that I was the parent who attended conferences, responded to emails, and showed up for school events. Beverly retained an expert witness, Dr. Franklin Yaboa, a clinical psychologist specializing in parental alienation, who reviewed my documentation and agreed to testify about the patterns he observed. Meanwhile, Ethan grew increasingly distant, spending hours in his room texting with his father, emerging only for meals and school. When I tried to talk to him about the hearing, he shut down completely. "You're going to lose," he said one evening, not looking up from his phone. "Dad's lawyer says you don't have a case." The words hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to grab him, shake him, make him see the truth. Instead, I went to my room and cried until I couldn't breathe. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday in late May, 5 days before Ethan's school let out for summer. I arrived at the courthouse at 8:30 a.m. With Beverly, my documentation organized in 3 identical binders, one for us, one for Grant's team, and one for the judge. Grant arrived with his attorney, a man named Theodore Ashworth from one of the most expensive family law firms in Northern Virginia. Grant was wearing a charcoal suit and a tie that probably cost more than my entire outfit. He didn't look at me as we took our seats at opposite tables. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, more intimate. Judge Patricia Brennan presided, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. She had a reputation for being thorough and unimpressed by theatrics. I didn't know yet whether that would work in my favor. The hearing began with opening statements. Theodore Ashworth painted a picture of a devoted father who had been systematically excluded from his son's life by a bitter ex-wife. He described Grant's transformation from workaholic to present parent, his desire to build a meaningful relationship with Ethan, and his concern that my rigid parenting style was damaging the boy's emotional development. Beverly countered with our narrative, a father who had abandoned his parenting responsibilities for 6 years, who had shown up only for the glamorous moments while leaving the daily work to me, who had manipulated his son's perception through extravagant gifts and subtle criticism. She referenced my documentation and promised to present evidence of a systematic pattern of missed visitations. Judge Brennan listened without expression, taking occasional notes. The real battle was about to begin. Grant testified first, and I have to admit he was compelling. He spoke eloquently about his regrets, his growth, his commitment to being the father Ethan deserved. He acknowledged missing visitations in the early years of the divorce, but claimed he had significantly improved his attendance over the past 2 years. He described his relationship with Ethan as close and trusting, a bond that had only deepened as the boy entered his teenage years. He expressed concern about my stress levels, my inflexibility, my tendency to prioritize rules over relationship. When Theodore Ashworth asked why Ethan wanted to live with him, Grant's voice actually cracked. "I think he finally feels like he can tell the truth about how he's been feeling," Grant said. "I think he's been afraid to express his preference because he didn't want to hurt his mother." I sat at my table, my face neutral, my hands clenched in my lap hard enough to leave nail marks on my palms. Beverly's cross-examination was surgical. She started by asking Grant to estimate how many scheduled visitations he had missed over the past 6 years. He guessed 15 or 20, attributing them to unavoidable work conflicts. Beverly then introduced Exhibit A, my spreadsheet documenting 312 instances of missed or significantly shortened visitations, totaling 847 hours of court-ordered parenting time. Grant's face tightened. "I don't know where those numbers come from," he said. "That seems extremely exaggerated." Beverly introduced Exhibit B, a selection of 150 text messages from Grant to me, each one canceling or rescheduling a scheduled visitation, each one time-stamped and dated. "Would you like me to read some of these aloud?" she asked. Theodore Ashworth objected. Judge Brennan overruled. Beverly read 12 messages spanning 6 years, each one a variation of the same theme. "Something came up. Can't make it. So sorry. We'll make it up to Ethan next time." By the time she finished, Grant's charm had begun to crack. The testimony from Dr. Franklin Yaboa was devastating. He had reviewed my documentation, interviewed me, and analyzed the pattern of Grant's behavior over 6 years. His conclusion was unequivocal. The evidence suggested a classic parental alienation dynamic, where one parent undermines the child's relationship with the other through a combination of manipulation, gift-giving, and subtle criticism. "What we see here is a father who was largely absent during the formative years," Dr. Yaboa explained to the court. "During the periods of contact, he positioned himself as the permissive, exciting parent while allowing the mother to handle the discipline and daily responsibilities. This creates a distorted perception in the child's mind where the absent parent is idealized and the present parent is resented." Theodore Ashworth tried to challenge his credentials and methodology, but Dr. Yaboa had testified in over 200 custody cases and wasn't easily rattled. His testimony took 2 hours and left Grant looking considerably less sympathetic. Then came the moment I'd been dreading. Ethan was called to testify. In Virginia, children over 12 can express their custody preference directly to the judge, either in open court or in chambers. Grant's team had pushed for open testimony, wanting the dramatic impact of a child choosing his father in front of everyone. Beverly had argued for a private chambers meeting, but Judge Brennan ultimately allowed Ethan to choose. He chose open court. I watched my son walk to the witness stand, his face pale but determined, and felt my heart break into pieces so small I wasn't sure they could ever be reassembled. Theodore Ashworth was gentle with him, asking softball questions about his life, his interests, his feelings. Then he asked the question that would determine my future. Ethan, where would you prefer to live? My son looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to the judge. I want to live with my dad, Ethan said. His voice was steady, rehearsed. My mom is always stressed out and busy. She has a million rules about everything. I can't talk to her about stuff because she just lectures me. Dad actually listens. Dad doesn't treat me like a little kid. I know my mom loves me, but I don't think she really sees me. He paused, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. She's never really there. Even when she's in the room, she's thinking about something else. The words hit me like bullets, each one finding a soft target. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed up helping him with homework, all the soccer games I'd attended alone because Grant was traveling, all the doctor's appointments, the school pickups, the bedtime stories, the 3 a.m. comfort when he had nightmares. Never really there. I had been there every single day, and somehow I had become invisible. Beverly's cross-examination of Ethan was gentle but pointed. She asked about specific visitations with his father, whether he remembered times when his dad had canceled plans. Ethan's answers were vague, deflecting. She asked about the gifts Grant had given him, the trips they'd taken, and how often those happened compared to everyday activities like homework help or cooking dinner together. Ethan seemed to struggle with these questions, his rehearsed narrative bumping up against concrete details he couldn't remember. Then Beverly asked a question that changed everything. Ethan, over the past 6 years, how many times do you think your father actually showed up for his scheduled visitations? Ethan thought for a moment. I don't know. Most of them, I guess. Beverly introduced Exhibit C, a chart showing Grant's actual attendance rate for scheduled visitations. 38%. Over 6 years, Grant had shown up for barely more than a third of his court-ordered parenting time. Ethan stared at the chart, confusion spreading across his face. That's not right, he said quietly. Dad comes to see me all the time. When was the last time your father came to pick you up for a weekend visit and stayed the entire weekend? Beverly asked. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Grant, then back at the chart. That can't be right. Dad said he's been trying to see me more, but Mom always makes it difficult. Beverly introduced Exhibit D, a series of text messages between Grant and me from the past 6 months. In each one, I confirmed the visitation schedule. In each one, Grant canceled within 48 hours of the scheduled pickup time. The excuses were familiar. Work conflict, travel emergency, feeling unwell. The pattern was undeniable. Ethan read the messages, his face shifting from confusion to something more complicated. Dad said those were times when you changed the schedule, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. He said you were making it hard for him to see me. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Brennan was studying the exhibits with an intensity that made me hold my breath. Grant sat at his table, his charm finally failing him, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. Theodore Ashworth was furiously writing notes, trying to salvage a case that was collapsing in real time. And Ethan, my son, my beautiful, manipulated son, was staring at his father with an expression I had never seen before. It was the look of someone realizing they had been lied to. Dad? Ethan's voice was small, childlike in a way it hadn't been in years. Did you really cancel all those times? Grant's mask slipped completely. For just a moment, his face showed the calculation beneath the charm, the cold assessment of a man trying to figure out how to spin this. Buddy, it's complicated. Work was really demanding, and your mom wasn't always flexible about rescheduling. I wanted to see you, but you didn't, Ethan said. You just kept saying you would, and then you didn't. Judge Brennan called a 30-minute recess. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, my hands shaking, my mind racing through everything that had just happened. Beverly sat next to me, reviewing her notes. That was a turning point, she said quietly. The judge saw Ethan's reaction to those exhibits. That's going to matter. I nodded, unable to speak. Across the hallway, I could see Grant talking urgently with Theodore Ashworth, his gestures sharp and frustrated. At some point, Ethan emerged from the courtroom and walked past his father without looking at him. He stopped in front of me, his face tear-streaked, his shoulders hunched. Is it true? He asked. Did Dad really miss all those times? I wanted to hug him, to protect him, to tell him it didn't matter. Instead, I told him the truth. Yes, sweetheart, it's true. I have records of every time he canceled, every text message, every email. I didn't want you to know because I didn't want you to feel rejected. But I also couldn't let you believe something that wasn't real. When the hearing resumed, Judge Brennan asked to meet with Ethan in chambers privately. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. When they emerged, Ethan's face was red from crying, but there was something different in his posture. He walked past Grant's table without a glance and came to sit behind me, in the gallery, rather than returning to the witness stand. Grant watched him with an expression that was equal parts confusion and anger. Judge Brennan returned to her bench and announced that she would be issuing her ruling immediately, rather than taking the case under advisement. My heart stopped. I had never heard of a judge ruling from the bench in a custody modification case. I have reviewed the extensive documentation provided by both parties, Judge Brennan began. I have considered the testimony of the expert witness, the guardian ad litem's report, and the expressed preference of the minor child. She paused, and the silence in that courtroom was absolute. The evidence presented today paints a clear picture of a father who has consistently failed to meet his visitation obligations over a period of 6 years. The petitioner missed approximately 62% of his scheduled parenting time, documenting this with text messages and emails that directly contradict his testimony about work demands and scheduling conflicts. More troubling, the evidence suggests a pattern of parental alienation, where the petitioner undermined the respondent's relationship with the child through expensive gifts, permissive parenting during limited contact, and subtle criticism that positioned the mother as the source of restrictions and unhappiness. Grant's face had gone gray. Theodore Ashworth was no longer taking notes. The child's expressed preference, while noted, appears to have been significantly influenced by this alienation dynamic. The minor's own reaction to the documentation presented today suggests that his understanding of his parents' respective involvement has been distorted by incomplete and inaccurate information provided by his father. Judge Brennan removed her reading glasses and looked directly at Grant. Mr. Hollister, you have presented yourself to this court as a reformed and devoted father seeking greater involvement in your son's life. The evidence tells a different story. You are not seeking involvement. You are seeking credit for involvement you have never actually provided. She turned to me, and her expression softened slightly. Ms. Hollister, the court recognizes the significant burden you have carried as the primary residential parent for the past 6 years. Your documentation demonstrates not only consistent presence in your son's life, but also a remarkable restraint in not using this information to influence your child's perception of his father. That restraint is noted and appreciated. I felt tears streaming down my face, but I didn't move to wipe them away. The petition for custody modification is denied, Judge Brennan announced. Primary residential custody will remain with the respondent. Furthermore, given the documented pattern of missed visitations and the evidence of parental alienation, the court is modifying the petitioner's visitation schedule. Visitation will now be supervised by a court-approved monitor for a period of 6 months, after which the arrangement will be reviewed. The petitioner is also ordered to attend parenting classes and individual therapy focused on rebuilding an honest relationship with his son. She paused, consulting her notes. Finally, the court is referring this matter to the Family Court Services Division for investigation of potential contempt charges related to the petitioner's systematic violation of the original custody order. Failure to appear for court-ordered visitation is not merely a personal choice, Mr. Hollister. It is a violation of a court order, and this court takes such violations seriously. The gavel came down, and it was over. Grant sat frozen at his table, his expensive lawyer gathering papers with the mechanical efficiency of someone who knows they've lost badly. Theodore Ashworth said something quietly to Grant, probably about appeals or motions, but Grant wasn't listening. He was staring at Ethan, who was sitting behind me with his head bowed, refusing to meet his father's eyes. I wanted to feel triumph. I wanted to feel vindication. Instead, I felt exhausted, hollowed out, like I'd won a war, but lost something essential in the process. My son had learned that his father was a liar. That was true. But he'd also learned that the person he'd trusted to protect him had been manipulating him for years. Some truths leave scars no matter how necessary they are. The drive home from the courthouse was quiet. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his face still streaked with dried tears. I didn't know what to say to him. Everything I thought of felt inadequate, either too much or not enough. When we pulled into our driveway, he finally spoke. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was small, broken. "About all the times he canceled?" "Because I didn't want you to feel like he didn't love you," I said carefully. "I thought if you knew, it would hurt you more than not knowing." "It hurt anyway," he said, just in a different way. "I thought you were the problem. I thought you were keeping him away." "I know, sweetheart, and I'm sorry you believed that. I should have found a better way to help you understand the truth without protecting a lie." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something he hadn't done in almost 2 years. He reached across the center console and took my hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for what I said in court, for all of it. I didn't know." I squeezed his hand, feeling something in my chest crack open. "You were 12 years old, and the person you trusted was telling you things that weren't true. That's not your fault, Ethan. None of this is your fault." We sat in the car for 20 minutes, not moving, just holding hands and letting the silence say what words couldn't. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. It was something more complicated than that. It was the beginning of rebuilding something that had been damaged so gradually I hadn't even noticed it breaking. The months that followed were hard, but they were hard in a way that felt honest. Ethan started therapy with a counselor who specialized in parental alienation, a woman named Dr. Joanna Kim, who helped him process the complicated feelings of loving a father who had lied to him. Grant attended his court-ordered parenting classes and supervised visitations, though his attendance was sporadic even with a monitor watching. Some people don't change, even when a judge orders them to. I kept documenting, kept saving every text message and every missed appointment, building a record that would protect us if Grant ever tried this again. But something had shifted. Ethan was different now, not healed exactly, but clearer. He saw his father for who he actually was, not the fantasy version Grant had constructed. A year after the custody hearing, Ethan asked if we could go to the courthouse together. I didn't understand why until we arrived, and he led me to a bench outside courtroom 4B. "This is where everything changed," he said. "I want to remember it." We sat on that bench for an hour, not talking much, just being present together in the place where the truth had finally come out. Eventually, Ethan turned to me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. It was the look of a child who trusts his mother, who believes she will protect him, who knows she has been there all along. "Thanks for not giving up on me," he said, "even when I was being terrible." I put my arm around him and pulled him close, feeling his solid weight against my side, feeling like my son had finally come home. Grant's contempt hearing happened 3 months later. The Family Court Services Division had reviewed my documentation and determined that his systematic violation of the custody order warranted consequences. He was fined $12,000 and sentenced to 40 hours of community service. More importantly, his visitation rights were reduced to twice-monthly supervised visits until Ethan turned 18. He could have fought it, could have hired another expensive lawyer and dragged us back to court. Instead, he quietly accepted the terms and then slowly faded from Ethan's life altogether. The visits became sporadic, then rare, then essentially non-existent. Some people only want to be parents when it's convenient and impressive. When it requires actual showing up, they disappear. 2 years after the custody battle, I ran into Theodore Ashworth at a coffee shop near the courthouse. He recognized me immediately, and to my surprise, approached my table. "Miss Hollister," he said, "I owe you something I should have said a long time ago." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Your documentation was remarkable. In 20 years of practicing family law, I've never seen a more comprehensive record of parental behavior. You won that case before we ever walked into the courtroom." I didn't know what to say. This was the man who had tried to take my son away, who had painted me as a bitter, controlling ex-wife. "I was doing my job," he continued. "But between you and me, I knew halfway through that hearing that my client was lying. The evidence was overwhelming." He nodded once, sharply, and walked away. I sat with my coffee, thinking about all the nights I'd spent updating that spreadsheet, screenshotting text messages, building a record that no one might ever see. It had felt obsessive at the time, maybe even paranoid, but it had saved my relationship with my son. Ethan turned 15 last month. He's taller than me now, with his father's dark hair and my stubborn streak. He still sees Grant occasionally, maybe once every few months, but the relationship has settled into something distant and civil rather than close. Ethan doesn't talk about it much, and I don't push. He's working through it at his own pace, in therapy and in conversations with friends who've experienced similar things. Sometimes I catch him looking at old photos from when he was little, before the divorce, before everything got complicated. I don't know what he sees in those pictures, what memories they trigger, but I know he's processing something important, something that will shape who he becomes as an adult. The documentation folder still exists on my computer. I haven't added to it in over a year, but I haven't deleted it either. It sits there like a scar, a reminder of what we survived and what we lost. Sometimes I think about the mother I was before all this started, the one who believed that co-parenting meant cooperation, that the truth would eventually become obvious, that children always know who really loves them. That mother was naive, but she was also right about one thing: the truth does eventually come out. It just sometimes takes 847 hours of missed visitations and 312 pages of documentation, and one moment in a courtroom when a child finally sees through the lies. Last week, Ethan got his driver's permit. I took him to the DMV, sat in the waiting room for 2 hours, filled out the paperwork, and watched him take his photo with the same mix of excitement and terror that every parent feels when their child reaches this milestone. When we got home, he asked if we could go for a practice drive around the neighborhood. I said yes, handed him the keys, and climbed into the passenger seat. He adjusted the mirrors carefully, checked his blind spots, and pulled out of the driveway with exaggerated caution. "You're doing great," I told him. He glanced over at me with a smile that reached his eyes. "Thanks for being here, Mom," he said. "I know you always have been." The thing about custody battles is that nobody really wins. Even when the judge rules in your favor, even when the truth comes out, even when your child finally sees through the manipulation, there are scars that don't heal. But there's also something else, something harder to name. There's the knowledge that you showed up, every single day, even when it wasn't glamorous or exciting or appreciated. There's the quiet satisfaction of knowing that your presence was so consistent, so reliable, that it became invisible until it was almost taken away. Grant told our son that I was never really there. The evidence proved otherwise. But the real proof wasn't in a spreadsheet or a text message or a courtroom exhibit. The real proof was in the 15-year-old boy who finally understood what being there actually means. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.